Good morning. Today I want to talk about the Table of Nations. You find it in Genesis chapter 10. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. This is one of the chapters in the Bible that people tend to skip over. It's a list of unpronounceable names that mean nothing to the average reader. But I hope that by the end of this sermon you'll be better informed. Let's start off with a story. In the late 1850s, this young man came into the British Museum every lunchtime and pored over the newly discovered cuneiform tablets. He actually taught himself to read cuneiform. His name was George Smith, and he was a printer's apprentice. He had a poor education, owing to poverty rather than lack of desire or lack of ability. He was met or accidentally encountered Rawlinson, the man who deciphered cuneiform. And the two got chatting, and it ended up that Smith was offered a job in the British Museum. Now, at first, he just worked as a volunteer in the evening, sorting and cleaning tablets, but he soon showed his worth because the museum had thousands of tablets discovered between 1840 and 1855, and nearly all of them were broken. And Smith was just the man to piece them together. He had an uncanny memory for shape and size, and he could look at a break and say, "Ah, now the piece from there is over here, box 3, second shelf." He was amazing. By 1870, he was the senior assistant in the Assyriology department of the British Museum, and in his spare time, he just wandered around the museum reading cuneiform inscriptions. And one that he read was this black obelisk, which had been brought back 30 years previously by Henry Layard from Nineveh. And in 1866, he read it and made an amazing discovery. And the following year, he presented a paper to the Society of Biblical Archaeology because he had recognized that the figure that is being pointed to by my friend there was the biblical king Jehu. He's bowing down before Shalmaneser III and paying tribute, and Smith was able to determine the date on which this happened. And Smith got a good deal of kudos and praise for this translation. Now, as he pieced the various tablets together, he was reading them like you or I might read a newspaper, and he came across this one, which told the story of an ancient hero called Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was very popular, or his legend was very popular. He was an actual king, but so many stories grew up about him, a bit like Robin Hood. Robin Hood seems to have been an actual historical character, but I don't know whether there ever was a Maid Marian, or, whether he did all those daring escapades with the Sheriff of Nottingham Castle and so on. Well, in the same way, Gilgamesh was a real person, but many, many legends accrued about him. For example, here's a picture of how he and Enkidu, his friend, defeated the Bull of Heaven, which had been sent by the goddess Ishtar, that's her over on the extreme left, to punish the people for their disrespect. Here's another depiction of the same incident, with Gilgamesh and Enkidu killing the Bull of Heaven. This is from a cylinder seal. Well, Smith found that there were 12 different tablets of these adventures of Gilgamesh. But it was when he came to this one, the 11th, that he really sat up, and people who were working with him at the time relate that he leapt from his chair and began to run around the table, throwing off his clothes and making animal noises. And he was soon invited to present another paper to the Society for Biblical Archaeology, and this time it was so much excitement that even the British Prime Minister, Gladstone, came along and was present. And he said, "I've recently been examining the mythological and mythical tablets. And from this section I obtained a number of tablets giving a curious series of legends, including a copy of the story of the flood. On discovering these documents, which were much mutilated, I searched over all the collections of fragments of the inscriptions, consisting of several thousands of smaller pieces, and ultimately recovered 80 fragments of these legends, by the aid of which I was enabled to restore nearly all of the text of the flood and considerable portions of the other legends." These tablets were originally at least 12 in number, forming one story or set of legends, the account of the flood being on the 11th tablet. Well, as you saw in the picture, the left-hand edge of the tablet is missing. 17 lines, in fact. So we don't have the full beginning of the story. Well, there was so much interest in this that the Daily Telegraph offered George Smith 1,000 guineas. I don't know what that would be in modern money. It'd be a considerable sum to go out to Nineveh and find the missing bit. An impossible task, you would think. I mean, if you dropped something in a Kidderminster street, how long would it stay there? You wouldn't expect to go back in 2,500 years and find it still lying there, would you? Well, Smith went out to Mosul and noticed the date. He began work on May 7, and just a week later, he had found the missing bit. Actually, it wasn't the missing bit. It wasn't the bit that had been broken off, but it was another tablet from which something else had been broken off, and the missing lines were there. And so he was able to get the complete story of Gilgamesh and the flood. It's interesting what Smith says. On reviewing the evidence, it's apparent that the events of the flood narrated in the Bible and the inscription are the same, occur in the same order. But the minor differences in the details show that the inscription embodies a distinct and independent tradition. Now, today scholars try and say, oh, the Bible author copied from the Assyrians. But Smith, who originally translated it, he was a pretty clever guy. He said, no, they're independent traditions. And this was borne out by Wallace Budge, who for a long time was the head of the British Museum and a pretty formidable scholar in his own right. It's probable that both the Sumerians and the Semites, that is, the Jews, each in their own way, attempted to commemorate an appalling disaster of unparalleled magnitude, the knowledge of which, through tradition, was common to both peoples, which, of course, is what we would expect. The flood would be remembered by everyone. It is, at all events, well known that the Sumerians regarded the deluge as an historic event which they are able to date. For some of their records contain lists of kings who reigned before the deluge, though it must be confessed that the lengths assigned to their reigns are incredible, or we simply don't understand them. After their rule, that is, after the rule of these kings before the deluge, it is expressly noted that the flood occurred and that when it passed away, kingship came down again from on high. So it's interesting that George Smith, or I would say God through George Smith, provided confirmation for the biblical flood story at just the time that it was under attack from evolutionists. God works to confirm his word. Okay, so let's go to the Table of Nations. Now, there have been numerous attempts at classifying the human races. This one is based on a particular type of DNA, and it shows man originating in the Congo region of West Africa. Here's a different map. This is based on paleontology and the study of fossils, pioneered by Louis Leakey. And he agrees that humans spread out of Africa, but he claims that we originated in the Ethiopian highlands. Here's another map which attempts to classify humans, this time on the basis of language, though you'll notice that they include India among the English-speaking countries, so I'm not sure how accurate the map is. Well, in the Bible, you have another classification of humanity based on the records that were available to Moses and the lists of the sons of Noah and their descendants. So let's begin. The sons of Japheth. Okay, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal. Javan. Now, Hebrew doesn't have a J, it uses the letter Y, or a V, which is W, so the name is probably Yawon, and it's better known to us as the Ionians, the Ionian Greeks. So we should place Javan in Greece, though it is believed that the Ionians migrated to Greece from Western Asia Minor. The name Dodanim, which is a plural, it refers to a nation or a race rather than an individual, and the name may be preserved in the Dodecanese Islands, possibly. On the other hand, in Hebrew, the letters D and R are very similar, so it may be Rodanim, in other words, the inhabitants of the island of Rhodes. Kittim, that's Cyprus. We're not sure of the exact location of Tarshish. Some locate it right over in the west in Spain, others put it in North Africa or even Sardinia, but it's somewhere over in that direction. Madai is believed to refer to the Medes, and Gomer has been identified with the Cimmerians, a nomadic tribe who were much feared in the ancient world. and the linguists tell us that the name Gomer is preserved in Crimea. Well, I don't know about that. There are Assyrian references to a king of Musku, which seem to place Meshech east of the Black Sea or possibly in northeastern Turkey. So this is the sons of Japheth. Elisha is either Sicily or Sardinia. The people of Tyre imported purple cloth from the islands of Elisha. Now let's look at the youngest son, Ham. His sons were Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. And there goes on with a list of grandsons. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. All right. Mizraim is a plural, is a dual, I beg your pardon, not a plural. And it refers to the fact that Egypt was always known in antiquity as the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, the Delta and the Nile Valley. So Egypt is Mizraim. Cush is the area known today as the Sudan, but there's a possibility that Cush first settled in southwest Arabia and then migrated across into the Nile Valley. Canaan, of course, is the ancestor of the Canaanites. Either Seba or Shaba was the ancestor of the Sabaeans, who lived in the area of modern Yemen. Cush, of course, is down in the Sudan, but Cush's son Nimrod was very definitely in Mesopotamia. So perhaps he left home to seek his fortune before his father reached Egypt. We just don't know. Phut is believed to be the land of Punt, famous for its exotic riches. Queen Hatshepsut sent an expedition there. Punt is thought to be Somaliland, and that seems to be borne out by most recent scientific studies. Some say, oh no, it's India, but I disagree with that, and the evidence does not appear to support it. For example, here you have the picture on Hatshepsut's temple of her expedition to Punt, and this is the Queen of Punt, and you can see that the individuals there are quite clearly negroid in appearance, though they must be fairly light-skinned, for they are depicted in the same reddish colour as the Egyptians themselves, which was sort of a light brown. Ham, it also mentions something interesting, that one of Ham's sons, or descendants, were the Caphtorim. Okay, now the Caphtorim is Crete, and you would think, based upon proximity and on the prevailing winds, that the people of Crete would have come from Greece. But the Bible says, no, they came from Ham's descendants. And there's an interesting entry in Wikipedia about the Minoans, which says about Cretan hieroglyphics. It's unknown whether the language is Minoan, and its origin is debated. Although the hieroglyphs are often associated with the Egyptians, they also indicate a relationship to Mesopotamian writings. So, of course, you have Nimrod in Mesopotamia and Ham and his descendants in Egypt. So, yeah, very interesting that they should mention both those in connection with Crete. Now let's go to Shem, the Semites, in other words. The sons of Shem were Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. Now the Elamites, you can see them there in green, were in southwest Iran. Ashur seems to have taken over the area that was once occupied by Nimrod, or perhaps was always there. Nimrod was just, he came to power there as a king. Aram is modern Syria, extended right down as far as the Sea of Galilee from the Turkish border. The Hadramaveth, is down in southeastern Saudi Arabia, and other of the Arabian tribes can be linked with some of the other sons of Shem. So if we end up with a map looking a bit like this, with the division of nations as Moses understood it at the time. Now, obviously, there are limitations to Moses' knowledge. In this table of nations, there is no mention of China, even though we're sure that it was inhabited in Moses' day. Unless Phut is India, there is no mention of India. Africa, south of the Sahara, is not mentioned, and of course neither is the Americas. And Australia, of course, it goes without saying. But even Persia is not mentioned. In other words, Moses' information covered those nations which impacted on the Middle East around 1400 BC, around the time when Moses was alive and Moses was writing. Now, associated with the Table of Nations in the very next chapter is a genealogy which gives some very long lengths of life. And that raises the question, are these lengths of life credible? Is this whole Table of Nations thing credible? Now, to answer that, I need to indulge in a rather lengthy diversion. So let's look again at George Smith's great discovery, the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mentioned that Gilgamesh had a very close friend called Enkidu. When Enkidu died, Gilgamesh was overcome with grief, and he determined to find a way to escape death. And after various adventures, he was told about Utnapishtim, which is known in the Sumerian as Ziusudra, who was immortal. So Gilgamesh went off in search of Utnapishtim. The only trouble was he lived in Dilmun, at the mouth of the rivers. Gilgamesh had to build a boat, he had to overcome various dangers along the way, and finally he visited Utnapishtim, who told him why he was given the gift of immortality. And that is where you get the flood story, because Utnapishtim was the person who lived through the flood. And he says, all I possessed, I collected it. All I possessed, I collected of the seed of life. I caused to go up into the ship all my male and female servants, the beasts of the field, the animals of the field, the sons of the army, all of them I caused to go up. It must have been a pretty massive ship. A flood Shamash made. Shamash is the sun god, and he spake, saying in the night, I will cause it to rain from heaven heavily. Enter to the midst of the ship, and shut thy door. The raging of a storm in the morning arose from the horizon of heaven, extending and wide. Vul in the midst of it thundered. Nebo and Saru went in front. The surface of the earth, and there's a gap in the text, it swept. It destroyed all life from the face of the earth. The strong tempest over the people reached to heaven. Even the gods feared the tempest and sought refuge. They ascended to the heaven of Anu, the highest heaven of all, like dogs with tails hidden, couched down. And then comes an interesting bit. Ishtar said, the world to sin has turned. This is the reason for the flood, which of course is exactly what Moses said in Genesis, because the world had become so sinful. 6 days and nights passed. The wind, tempest, and storm overwhelmed. On the 7th day, the storm was calmed, and all the tempest which had destroyed like an earthquake quieted. I was carried through the sea. This is Utnapishtim speaking. The doer of evil and the whole of mankind who turned to sin, like reeds their corpses floated. To the country of Nisir went the ship. The mountain of Nisir stopped the ship. To pass over it was not able. And then he tells of how he let out various birds, a dove, a swallow. Neither of them could find a resting place. Both returned, and finally he sent out a raven. The raven went, and the corpses on the waters it saw, and it did eat. It swam. Obviously Utnapishtim didn't know much about ravens, and wandered away and did not return. And so I sent the animals forth to the four winds. I poured out a libation. I built an altar on the peak of the mountain. You can see there the parallels with the story of Noah. Now, Dilmun, where Gilgamesh had to go to meet Utnapishtim and where Utnapishtim was living, it was a real place. And the people there used stamp seals instead of cylinder seals as they did in the rest of Mesopotamia. It was regarded as a land of luxury, where people feasted all day long, drinking beer through long straws. You can see them here in this other picture. It was regarded as a paradise. It was well watered. It was fertile. There were wild beasts in abundance because Dilmun was holy. It offered sanctuary to animals. There wasn't any hunting or killing. In fact, it was sort of, a heaven on earth. In Dilmun, the raven utters no cry. The wolf snatches not the lamb. Unknown is the kid-devouring wild dog. Unknown is the grain-devouring boar. The sick-eyed says not, I am sick-eyed. The sick-headed says not, I am sick-headed. Its old woman says not, I am an old woman. Its old man says not, I am an old man. It was a land of eternal youth, of immortality. Now, in later years, in the historical periods, if you like, Dilmun became an important trading center. It was halfway between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, and the citizens of Dilmun grew very rich on the trade between the two, and this position has led people to identify it with Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. But why on earth would anyone consider the barren, hot desert island of Bahrain to be a paradise for plants and animals? Well, the first thing to remember is that immediately after the flood, you had the ice ages when there was extensive glaciation. And the climate was very different. The Sahara was teeming with life. Even the deserts of Arabia were lush pastures. So no surprise that Dilmun, or Bahrain, was considered exceptionally fertile. But even more than that, in Bahrain you have numerous springs of fresh water that well up on the island. When the Arab traveller Ibn Battuta went there, he said, "We then travelled from Siraf to the city of Al-Bahrain, a fine large city with gardens, trees and streams. Water is easy to get at there. One digs with one hand in the sand, and there it is." In fact, there are springs even out in the water that surrounds the island, and these springs, some of them are so powerful that you can be out there in the middle of all this salt water, let down a bucket, and bring up fresh water that you can drink. Amazing. Well, in the Bible, we're told that there was a river in Eden. But the next statement, from there it was separated into four headwaters, or four heads, is not clear. Does it mean that the river flowed through Eden and then divided downstream to form a delta before flowing into a sea or a marsh or something? Or did the four rivers join upstream to make one river that flowed through Eden? Well, I don't know. In the New Earth, we're told there will be no sea, so therefore nothing in which a river can form a delta. So possibly it should be four rivers that join together to make one big river. Well, here's a map of the Middle East. Down in the south, you have Bahrain, Dilmun, as it's believed to be. And then you have these rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, which don't seem to want to display very happily there. The Tigris parallels the Euphrates. Now, Ararat is up in that area. That is the mountain that's called modern Ararat. I don't believe it is the biblical Ararat. In fact, the Bible doesn't say the Mount Ararat. It speaks about the mountains of Ararat, plural. And almost certainly is a reference to the mountains of Urartu, which was an area in northeast Mesopotamia. In the Gilgamesh tablet, Ushnapishtim says, "On Mount Nisir the boat lodged firm. Mount Nisir held the boat, allowing no movement." So this Mount Nisir is part of the Urartu range. In 2018, when my wife and I flew back from Australia, we paralleled the mountains all the way up the Euphrates Valley. And I took this picture when I reckon we were approximately in the region of Mount Nisir. So it could be that one of those snow-covered mountains is Mount Nisir, and I couldn't tell you which one. Now picture the scene when Noah comes out of the ark. Everywhere's bare and destroyed. The only thing that's at all familiar is a stream. And Noah thinks, well, if we follow this stream, it will lead us eventually to Eden. And although we're not allowed into Eden, we can, take up residence around it as we did before. So they set off. They have to stop along the way to grow crops. It's slow journeying. Noah grows old and dies. Shem carries on the search. And eventually, worn out with travel, he comes to a lush garden with plenty of fresh water, and he settles down there. Bahrain, Dilmun. But then something strange happens. Shem doesn't die. Now here we have the lengths of life as recorded in the Bible. Here you have Adam, followed by his son Seth, okay, and you can see the point at which Adam died. And we go down through these various names. Enoch, of course, lived only a short time before he was taken away by God. Methuselah, the longest man who ever lived, and so we've marked his death. But notice that Methuselah overlapped with Adam by a considerable period. So he could have heard Adam tell the story of Eden and the fall and all the rest of it. Then you have Lamech, and then you have Noah. And Noah, of course, overlaps with Methuselah, as does his son, Shem. So Shem could have heard the story from Methuselah, who heard it from Adam. Okay? So it's not like ages and ages of oral tradition, oral being passed down. This was something that was only just, great-grandfather sort of thing. But now, notice Shem. His children, with the exception of Eber, all die before him. And it must have seemed to the people of those days that Shem was immortal. The old man just kept on going. All his sons and grandsons and great-grandsons and great-great-grandsons died, but he just kept on going. It isn't until you get down to Joseph that finally you have one of the descendants born after Shem died. So generation after generation think that Shem is immortal. No wonder the author of the Gilgamesh epic claims that the gods have given Utnapishtim, if he is Shem, immortality. Now, a few years ago, I went out to Bahrain specifically to see the mound fields of Bahrain. Here they are. There are approximately 350,000 of these burial mounds, arranged in different groups. This is the Ali mound field. You can see how big these mounds are. Most of them are around about the same height as a man, but there are a few. You can see them in the distance there. They're absolutely gigantic. The problem is that the mounds come from a period before Dilmun was a busy trading center. So where did all these people come from, and why did they come here? Well, the answer is Dilmun was regarded as holy, and people may well have come from far away in the hopes of sharing in Utnapishtim's immortality. Some years ago, I came across this book looking for Dilmun, and I've read it twice. It's so fascinating, because this chap, Geoffrey Bibby, conducted excavations in Bahrain. He excavated some of the burial mounds. He found that each one of them contained a single burial, and inside some of them he found bowls filled with clean white sand, pottery bowls. Naturally, of course, as an archaeologist, he brushed the sand away, and buried in the sand were the skeletons of snakes. Well, snakes, because they shed their skins, were regarded either as symbols of immortality or as actually immortal. And one of the snakes actually had a pearl in its mouth, and pearls also are regarded as a charm for immortality. So I believe that Utnapishtim the immortal was in fact Shem, not Noah. Just as modern novelists will include a real historical fact in his work of fiction, though he may tweak them to fit the storyline, so the author of Gilgamesh alluded to the fact of Shem's long life. So, does the Table of Nations matter to us? Well, first it emphasizes what the King James translates as, "He has made of one blood all the nations of men." Racial discrimination is discriminating against members of our own family simply because they look different. We should all be one, and in Christ we can all be one, because we're all descended from the one ancestor. Secondly, you have the remarkable story of how the flood tablet was discovered just in time to answer those who were attacking the historicity of Genesis. God's hand is indeed over his word to preserve it and vindicate it. And finally, there's the fact that even tiny details like Utnapishtim's immortality can, if interpreted correctly, provide support for the Bible. Bible critics are quick to read objections to the Bible story into every tiny detail. Well, we can do the same in support of the Bible. So there's a lot of fascinating stuff in the Table of Nations. I've only just touched on the edges of it, but well repays study and investigation. And now may the grace of God, the love of Jesus, and the close friendship of the Holy Spirit be with us all, till he come. Amen.